At first glance, James W. Hall III looked like the kind of man the system trusted without question. A quiet Army warrant officer, a signals intelligence analyst, a man with years of training, top-secret clearances, and access to America's most sensitive electronic intelligence programs. He wasn't loud, he wasn't reckless, he didn't fit the image of a traitor, and that was exactly why no one suspected him.
For years, James Hall worked inside the heart of U.S. military intelligence in Europe. He had access to systems designed to listen, intercept, and understand the electronic heartbeat of the Soviet military. Radars, communications, electronic warfare signals. Information that took billions of dollars to develop. Information that NATO depended on in the event of war. And for 6 years, Hall sold it all. Not because he believed in communism, not because he hated America, not because he was recruited under pressure. He did it for money.
By the early 1980s, the Cold War wasn't fought only with tanks and missiles. It was fought in silence, in frequencies, in encrypted transmissions bouncing across Europe. One of the crown jewels of that silent war was the NSA Field Station in Berlin. Perched high above the city, it listened constantly, tracking Warsaw Pact troop movements, identifying radar signatures, mapping electronic patterns that could reveal where Soviet armor, aircraft, and missile systems were hiding. This was not information meant to be copied, not meant to leave the building, not meant to be seen by anyone outside tightly controlled compartments. James Hall had access anyway.
Each day, instead of focusing on his assigned duties, he quietly copied classified material, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 2. He memorized procedures, he collected documents, he learned exactly what America was listening for, where it was listening, and how those systems worked. Then he stayed late. To his supervisors, that looked like dedication, commitment, a hard-working analyst willing to go the extra mile. In reality, he stayed late to finish the job he was paid for, because he had already spent his workday stealing secrets.
When no one was watching, Hall smuggled original classified documents out of the facility. Not in briefcases, not in hidden compartments, in shopping bags. He carried them out like groceries. Those originals were never meant to leave the building, but Hall knew the routines. He knew how long documents could be gone without raising alarms. He knew when audits happened. He knew where blind spots existed. Once outside, the documents traveled with him. Sometimes to Frankfurt, sometimes to safe houses arranged by East German intelligence. There, everything was copied, page by page, thousands of them. Then Hall brought the originals back, quietly returning them before anyone noticed they were missing. No alarms, no missing files, no internal investigation. For years, it worked perfectly.
The intelligence he sold was devastating. He handed over details of Project Trojan, a global electronic warfare network designed to locate Soviet military assets by their signal emissions during wartime. A system meant to give the United States and NATO a decisive advantage. Once compromised, that advantage disappeared. He sold the complete National Signals Intelligence Requirements List, thousands of pages outlining what America prioritized, what it monitored, and how it collected information country by country. With that knowledge, the Soviets didn't need to guess anymore. They knew exactly what to hide, what to change, what frequencies to avoid. U.S. military liaison mission procedures were compromised as well, including how American teams photographed Soviet tanks and installations during inspection tours in East Germany. That information would later have deadly consequences. But while intelligence professionals across Europe noticed systems failing, operations going dark, and countermeasures appearing far too quickly, no one knew why. Sources dried up, electronic warfare techniques stopped working, signals that once provided clear insight suddenly went silent. Someone was talking. The problem was scale. Hundreds of soldiers, civilians, and contractors had pieces of the puzzle. Thousands had partial access. Finding one traitor among them felt impossible. And James Hall looked clean, too clean.
He lived well, but not outrageously, at first. Then came the car, a brand new Volvo, paid in cash. Later, a truck, a house with a large down payment. flying lessons at a private airfield, trips abroad that didn't match his salary. When asked, Hall always had an answer: an inheritance, a trust fund from a wealthy aunt, smart investments, family money. He told different stories to different people, but none of them sounded unbelievable. And when a superior once mentioned the Volvo during a routine background check, the explanation was accepted without verification. The paperwork was filed, the note was made, and no one followed up.
Because on paper, James Hall was exactly who he claimed to be: a loyal soldier, a skilled analyst, a man who waved the flag and did his job. By the late 1980s, however, the damage was becoming impossible to ignore. American electronic warfare capabilities were being countered within months, not years. NATO communication security procedures suddenly failed. Soviet forces demonstrated knowledge they shouldn't have had. Someone with deep access was bleeding secrets. Then, in December 1988, something changed. An East German intelligence officer defected, and he brought a name: James W. Hall III. The timeline fit, the access fit, the damage fit. For the first time in years, suspicion finally had a target.
Army counterintelligence moved quickly. Surveillance confirmed what the paperwork had missed. Hall's lifestyle didn't match his income. The purchases were real. The money trail didn't add up. But suspicion wasn't enough. They needed proof. They needed Hall to incriminate himself. So they built a trap. By December 1988, James Hall believed he was untouchable. For 6 years, he had moved secrets out of secure facilities without triggering alarms. For 6 years, he had met handlers, delivered material, and collected cash without consequences. Every story he told had worked. Every lie had held. So when word reached him that his usual East German contacts were unavailable, he didn't hesitate. A new arrangement was proposed. A Soviet intelligence officer wanted to meet. Routine business. Hall didn't question it. Didn't slow down. Didn't show paranoia. That alone told investigators everything they needed to know. On the evening of December 20th, 1988, Hall walked into a modest hotel room at a Days Inn in Savannah, Georgia. He carried a manila envelope. Inside were classified documents, not copies, original intelligence material. The man waiting for him introduced himself as a KGB officer. Calm, professional, fluent in Russian. What Hall didn't know was that the man across the table was an FBI special agent, born in the Soviet Union, trained specifically for this role. The room was wired. Hidden cameras were already recording. Hall sat down comfortably, like a man who had done this many times before, because he had. At first, the conversation was business. The agent examined the documents, asked routine questions, checked classifications. Hall explained everything willingly: where the material came from, how sensitive it was, why it was valuable. Then the questions became more personal. How long had Hall been working for Soviet intelligence? Hall didn't hesitate. 6 years.
What had he provided? Hall leaned in. Signals intelligence capabilities, electronic warfare systems, operational procedures, targeting methods. How had he done it? Hall smiled. He explained how he copied classified documents daily at NSA Field Station Berlin, how he removed originals in shopping bags, how he met East German handlers in Frankfurt to photocopy everything, how he returned the documents before anyone noticed. He spoke with pride, not fear. The agent pressed further. How much money had he made? Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why had he done it? This was the moment investigators would later replay over and over. Hall didn't mention ideology, didn't mention politics, didn't mention resentment. He said it plainly. Money.
He wanted to live better. He wanted security. He didn't want to worry about his next dollar. He insisted he wasn't anti-American, said he waved the flag just like anyone else. He simply liked getting paid. The longer the meeting went on, the more relaxed Hall became. He talked about dead drops in Germany, about handlers he trusted, about methods that had never failed him. He even talked about the future. He still had access. He could provide more. He was willing to continue. Every word was recorded. 43 minutes. 43 minutes of uninterrupted confession. When the meeting ended, the agent handed Hall $30,000 in cash. Hall accepted it without hesitation.
As he walked out of the hotel room, FBI agents followed him at a distance. He went home. He slept. 24 hours later, the doorbell rang. It was December 21st, 1988. FBI agents and Army counterintelligence officers surrounded Hall's residence near Fort Stewart, Georgia. Hall answered the door calmly. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He was arrested and read his rights. Inside the house, agents found classified material Hall had kept as insurance, evidence of his espionage communications, and the $30,000 from the hotel meeting. Hall said nothing. His lawyer would speak for him. That same day, another arrest took place in Tampa, Florida. A man named Hussein Yildirim, a naturalized U.S. citizen, an auto mechanic, and Hall's purrier. Yildirim had carried material between Hall and East German intelligence officers. He knew the handlers, he knew the routes. With his arrest, the network collapsed. The espionage operation was over.
The damage assessment was just beginning. When James Hall was taken away in handcuffs, the espionage was over, but the damage had already been done. Behind closed doors, U.S. Army Counterintelligence and the National Security Agency began the most uncomfortable phase of the case. They had to answer one question: what exactly had been lost? The answer was worse than anyone expected. James Hall hadn't stolen fragments. He hadn't leaked isolated documents. He had handed over the blueprint.
Project Trojan was the first to be examined. It wasn't a single device or weapon. It was a worldwide electronic warfare network, a system designed to identify Soviet armored units, aircraft, and missile systems by analyzing their electronic emissions, radar pulses, communication signatures, electronic fingerprints unique to each platform. Project Trojan was meant to give NATO early warning and targeting advantages in wartime. Hall gave the Soviets enough detail to understand how it worked, which meant they could counter it, deceive it, hide from it. Years of development were compromised by one man with a Xerox machine.
Next came the National Signals Intelligence Requirements List, thousands of pages detailing what the United States cared about most, which countries, which systems, which frequencies. With that document, Soviet intelligence no longer had to guess. They knew what America was listening for, where it was listening, and how often. They could redesign their communication security accordingly. They could speak freely on channels they knew were ignored. They could shift critical traffic to blind spots. Entire listening operations went dark. NSA Field Station Berlin had to be treated as fully compromised. Every frequency, every procedure, every analytic method Hall had touched was now suspect. The station had been one of the most important Cold War listening posts in Europe, and suddenly it couldn't be trusted.
Then, investigators reached a file that carried real weight: U.S. military liaison mission operations in East Germany. These missions were officially permitted under post-war agreements. American officers conducted observation tours, photographing Soviet equipment and installations. Hall had revealed how those teams operated: routes, approach methods, photography techniques. 3 months later, on March 24, 1985, a U.S. Army officer named Major Arthur D. Nicholson, Jr. was killed during one of those tours. He was unarmed. A Soviet sentry shot him without warning. The Soviets claimed Nicholson had entered a restricted area. American officials disputed the claim. At the time, no one publicly connected the incident to espionage. Years later, the timeline told a different story. Hall had compromised USML procedures months before Nicholson's death. Soviet forces knew exactly how these teams moved, what they carried, how they approached sensitive sites. Some intelligence officials believe Nicholson walked into a trap designed using Hall's information.
That possibility would never appear on a balance sheet. The damage assessments listed programs, systems, costs. They didn't quantify lives. They didn't calculate what it cost Nicholson's family. As the assessment continued, the scope expanded. Every source Hall had known was now endangered. Every capability he described was assumed compromised. Encryption systems had to be replaced, frequencies changed, procedures rewritten. Across Europe, intelligence operations were reset. The cost ran into billions. But the deeper cost was time. Years of strategic advantage vanished overnight. While America rebuilt, the Soviet Union adjusted faster, because they already knew what was coming. And Hall had done it all for money. Less than $300,000 over 6 years.
Less than $5,000 a month. In exchange, he handed America's adversaries a 5-year head start. Only after the damage assessment began did investigators look back and see the warning signs they'd missed. The Volvo, the cash purchases, the conflicting stories. One major had noticed. He had asked questions. The answers sounded reasonable. They were documented. And then forgotten. No one verified the trust fund. No one confirmed the inheritance. No one audited Hall's finances. Security procedures existed, but they weren't followed through. Hall's access increased. His betrayal deepened. By the time an East German defector finally spoke, the damage was irreversible. James Hall hadn't been caught by vigilance. He had been caught by chance. And that realization shook the intelligence community.
Because it meant the system hadn't failed once, it had failed repeatedly. When James Hall finally spoke in court, the Cold War was already changing. But the damage he caused did not fade with politics. In March 1989, Hall stood before a military court at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He faced multiple charges of espionage, conspiracy, serious security violations. On paper, the maximum penalty was death. Hall's attorney knew the case was unwinnable. There was no argument to make, no evidence to challenge, no witness to discredit. The videotape existed, 43 minutes of Hall explaining his crimes in his own words. So a deal was struck. Hall would plead guilty to 10 counts of espionage. In return, the government would take the death penalty off the table. Life imprisonment was also removed. Instead, 40 years. Hall agreed to cooperate fully, to explain everything he had sold, every contact, every method.
On March 9, 1989, the military judge delivered the sentence: 40 years in prison, a $50,000 fine, forfeiture of all proceeds from espionage, dishonorable discharge from the United States Army. Hall was sent to the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, maximum security, a place reserved for the most serious offenders in the armed forces. Inside, Hall became inmate number 86448. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't admired. Espionage for money carried no honor, even among criminals. He kept to himself, served his time quietly, avoided trouble. 6 months later, his courier faced justice. Hussein Yildirim stood trial in federal court in Washington, D.C.
The evidence was overwhelming. He had transported classified material, facilitated meetings, enabled one of the most damaging intelligence breaches of the Cold War. In July 1989, he was convicted on all charges. 2 months later, he was sentenced to life in prison. No deal, no reduction. Years later, after the Cold War ended, Yildirim would be pardoned and deported back to Turkey. Hall received no such mercy. In prison, time moved slowly. The world outside changed. The Soviet Union collapsed. East Germany disappeared. The Cold War ended. But Hall remained. In 2006, more than 15 years after his sentencing, an author interviewed him inside Fort Leavenworth. It was the first time Hall had ever spoken publicly. When asked why he had done it, his answer was blunt. He didn't call himself a spy. He didn't pretend there was ideology involved. He called himself greedy. He said he wanted money and didn't care about the consequences. He admitted he had betrayed trust, that he had sold secrets without thinking about who would be hurt. There was no redemption arc, no dramatic justification, just regret, too late to matter.
Hall served 22 years of his 40-year sentence. In September 2011, he was released under federal supervision. He was 53 years old. The intelligence world he had betrayed no longer existed in the same form. The programs he compromised had been redesigned, the procedures rewritten, the systems rebuilt at enormous cost. Germany eventually returned thousands of pages of documents Hall had stolen and sold decades earlier. Most of them were no longer operationally relevant. History had moved on. Hall disappeared into obscurity. No memoir, no public appearances, no attempt to explain himself. Today, his name survives in training manuals, in intelligence schools, in counterintelligence briefings, in security awareness programs. Not as a legend, as a warning.
Because James Hall did not defeat the system through brilliance, he exploited complacency. Unexplained wealth was noticed, but not verified. Lifestyle discrepancies were documented, but not investigated. Procedures existed, but follow-through didn't. The lesson became clear. The most dangerous threats don't always come from ideology.
They don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they look like dedicated employees who stay late, who do their jobs well, who simply live a little better than their salary should allow. And if no one asks why, really asks, the damage can run into billions. James Hall did not look like a threat. That is why his case still matters.
He wasn't reckless. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't driven by ideology or rage. He was ordinary, an analyst who stayed late, a warrant officer who followed procedures, a man who appeared committed to his work, and that was enough. For 6 years, James W. Hall III sold America's most sensitive signals intelligence to its Cold War adversaries, not because he believed in their cause, but because the system allowed him to believe he wouldn't be caught. When intelligence agencies studied the case afterward, the most disturbing conclusion wasn't the scale of the damage, it was how easily it happened. The red flags existed: unexplained wealth, cash purchases, conflicting stories about income. Each one was noticed, each one was written down, and each one was accepted without verification. No one checked whether the trust fund existed. No one confirmed the inheritance. No one audited the finances, because the system was built on trust, and Hall understood that.
He exploited the space between suspicion and proof, between documentation and investigation. The Cold War produced many spies driven by ideology. Hall was different. He proved that greed alone could do just as much damage. Project Trojan had to be redesigned, signals intelligence priorities rewritten, entire operational frameworks rebuilt. Years of strategic advantage were lost. Some costs could be measured in dollars, others couldn't. The death of Major Arthur Nicholson Jr. remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case, a reminder that intelligence failures don't stay abstract. They reach real people. After his release in 2011, Hall vanished from public view. The money was gone, the career destroyed, the reputation erased. What remained was a case study. Today, his name is taught not to glorify espionage, but to warn against it. Because the lesson is uncomfortable. The most dangerous insiders are not always angry, not always radical, not always careless. Sometimes they are patient, quiet, and motivated by nothing more complex than wanting more than their salary allows.
James Hall sold 6 years of American intelligence for $300,000, less than the cost of a luxury car and a house. In return, he compromised systems worth billions, put lives at risk, and forced an entire intelligence apparatus to relearn how to protect itself. That imbalance is why this story is still told, not because it is dramatic, but because it is real. If this story stayed with you, take a moment before you leave. These cases don't surface on their own. They stay visible only when people choose to engage with them. If you want more stories drawn from declassified records, court transcripts, and Cold War archives, consider subscribing. Leave a comment and tell us what stood out to you, or simply write "Never Forget," because remembering cases like this is how the next one is prevented.